This session is about hotspot policing in the UK and how it's been used to address violence. And it's a reflection on whether or not we're getting it right. The evidence is quite positive. It's certainly improving. But I want to provide, if I can, a little bit of context first for the circumstances in which you'll hear the three presentations that are coming. The College of Policing and the Home Office in the UK made a substantial sum of money available to 18 forces, GRIP forces, to do some hotspot policing to reduce violence. And Larry led a piece of work with some assistance from myself to do the reviews of those 18 police forces to identify what was good and potentially where they could make some improvements in their policing of those hotspots. So I'm going to touch on, just very briefly, some of the general findings of where things could be improved, where things were improved, and then you're going to get three more detailed and nuanced presentations from Jeff, Matt and Barack. But just first of all, touching on some of the general things that have been improved, are being improved, and I hope are going to be taken forward into the next round of GRIP funding, with the 18 plus 2 now 20 forces are going to have the opportunity to make that policing even better and even more nuanced and more targeted. There was a lot of learning around identifying and removing false hotspots, police stations, prisons, and concentrations of crime that hotspot policing couldn't really impact on. There was learning around the sort of violent crimes not to count, possession of offensive weapons. That's not a measure of citizen safety, it's a measure of police proactivity, and it can lead to skewing of the hotspots. There's also some really nice learning around when some police forces gave the sergeants or the first line supervisors access to the location data of where their constables had been. You saw a step change in compliance. The officers were actually where they were supposed to be more often. And there was also an acceptance that in the same way that all crimes aren't created equal, all violent crimes aren't created equal, and they're not equally preventable by hotspot policing. So that led to some nice analysis in some forces, creating 168-hour profiles of the week, so that some hotspots were only hot at certain times. Some hotspots were only hot in certain seasons, in the summer. And then, using all that learning, the forces were getting those products reviewed, those new hotspots reviewed, with local officers and analysts to quality assure what was going on, to do a bit of reality checking and improving things further. So we're going to start off in a minute with Jeff, who's going to do his presentation on some of the real challenges in the Met Police hotspot hexagons. Matt, who's then going to talk about improving implementation in Bedfordshire, and Michelle's here somewhere. So that's very much a collaboration. And then Barack's going to finish off with police security collaboration. And Larry will then give some sort of final comments and commentary, and we'll do question and answers as time permits.
Before we get into what we did most recently in London, let's talk about what we did at the very end of the first lockdown when we thought we'd beaten COVID. So this is May 2020, the first lockdowns ending at the beginning of May. For 3 weeks, we kicked off an experiment, and the idea was, can we capitalize on the reduction of violent crime we saw during the lockdown and keep it going? So at the end of the experiment, where we had treatment and control locations that, we actually had treatment and control location days. So each day there were 300 some or 400 some hotspots, maybe 200 some, I don't remember. But every day these hotspots would either get patrolled or they wouldn't, and that was all randomly determined. But in the end, this is violent offenses, and we did not get the results we expected. So on the left here, the number of offenses did not go down in the treatment group. In fact, it went up, but not significantly. And then on the amount of crime harm, the only place we got a result in the right direction was at 100 meters away from the hotspot, a circle 100 meters in diameter or in radius from the hotspot. And you can see, but it was not statistically significant. So we didn't get the results we wanted, and immediately said, well, how hotspots work everywhere. How could they not have worked? Now, we did not have all set up during the lockdown. We didn't have time to set up GPS tracking. So when Simon Williams and I did our thing in Western Australia, we had phones on each officers. We could track each of them. We didn't. So we went with self-reporting, and this is my best slide I've ever made in my career. So now you'll see it. Now, I'm going to put up a slide, and I'm going to want all of you to take a guess how long in this, I'll show you the self-reports, and then you can guess how long we asked them to stay. Now, how long do you think we asked the Met officers to stay in place? Now, it's somewhere between 29 and 31 minutes is what we asked for. So if you were to go with this, we got great compliance, self-reported, in delivering the patrols we asked. But after the fact, we found out that we could get a hold of GPS data from the airwave radios, and we couldn't track the specific officers who were assigned day to day to each of the hotspots, because the self-reports didn't always record that all that well. But what we could do is see, was there a difference in Met-wide radio pings in these spots? And then we changed it to officer hours. And the things we discovered is, yes, we did get more patrol on treatment days than we did on control days. That was good. But the really surprising thing was just how much time got delivered on days when they were in control. The rest of the Met was going there, even though our assigned officers were not. And this was our first indication that London has some differences. In these hotspots, the local officers who work in these locations, they know these spots are hot. They go through them. And that seems to become a theme. So that takes us into a year later, we kick off a new one. And we did a couple things different in Operation Avert. First of all, we did it in hexagons. Hexagons are the bestagons. All right? And so that made all the difference in the world. But you can see how big they are. They're reasonably small. They're not very large. There were something like 122,000 of these hexes all across London, and then we scored them for violent crime and we picked them out. The other rule we had in picking them out was that none of the hotspots could touch each other. So there had to be at least this unused gap between any of the hotspots. And that way we could track dosage of patrol by putting a little bit of a buffer around it, and the buffers wouldn't overlap. And so what we ended up with was 170 of these targeted hexagons across London, and all of these got patrolled on some days, and then other days randomly did not get patrolled. But we also added something new, and we added 58 of these blue locations. These are pure controls. Not only did they not get patrolled, but the officers working on Operation Avert did not know where these were. They didn't even know we had pure controls. So they couldn't patrol them. They didn't know where they were, unless they just went there anyway. How did we do the random assignment? I don't have a lot of time today. I'm not going to go through all these points. But basically, every single day, we had 84 officers assigned. Those 84 officers were put into pairs. Each pair of officers would then get, would typically have 2 locations assigned. Sometimes they had more if they were really close together. And then they were asked to deliver patrols that lasted 30 minutes. And they only worked from 2 p.m. to midnight. So all the results I'm going to show you today are actually only during that 14 to 24 time period. And then the important thing is every single day we had 72 locations active. So remember, we had 170 we were doing, but 72 each day were made active. So if we look at 1 week from October, if you really stare at these red dots as I run through them, because I'm going to run through them fairly quickly, you'll see that they turn on and off in kind of a random pattern. But they also stay on for multiple days. That was part of the random assignment too. But basically, Avert followed this complicated pattern of turning sunspots on and off on different days. Now, what happened during the patrols? This is part of London's difference. So one of the first questions is, how big was this operation? How many different officers worked and delivered these patrols? So I counted them up. It's 4,542 different officers produced a GPS ping in our hotspot, in the hotspot, when they were assigned to go to that hotspot. So these aren't people who signed up for it and didn't bother to go. If you were to take those 4,542 constables and you rank them all up, that is the 5th biggest force in England and Wales, all by itself. We also had different time periods in the experiment. So this began in late July. We had a pre-test time where we were just trying to get the radios worked out, get the GPS pings, get the data flowing, and also getting people to comply. So for the first little bit, if you look at sort of these, where these shaded bars, that's how many hours we wanted the police to deliver into our hotspots on that specific day. The dark blue bars are how much they actually delivered. It didn't go so well during the pre-test. But beginning at sometime in about September, we felt we could start what we called, at that point, we just called AVERT. It was just called Operation AVERT. Then there was an AVERT 2 that I'll never talk about. And then we had to end up changing our thing. So we'll call it AVERT 1A right now. So 108 hours of patrolling was designed to be delivered every single day. That's the same 72 locations. Each of them get 90 minutes. So they were supposed to get 3 patrols of those 30 minutes each day. And you can see that our success gradually got better. And then we got results that you'll see in a minute that made us say, ooh, maybe we need to do something different. So beginning on the 17th of January, we started AVERT 1B. So we massively increased the amount of time that we were asking the officers to deliver. We had to change the patrol pattern to make that a reality. But you can also see compliance went really up, except for one day when it was really, really windy and they told everybody not to go outside. So there was that one day in February. Now, the amount of patrolling we delivered into these hotspots, I've got it up there at the top, 21,203 hours. 20, okay. If you do the math, that's almost 2.5 years of additional patrolling that got delivered into these hotspots, really in just 6 months of time. Because if you look at the AVERT 1A period, I've arbitrarily decided to start it on the 25th of September. That's the point at which our compliance with what we were asking for patrol went over 50% in the 14-day moving average. So that's the point where more days we were delivering at least half of the patrol we wanted. You can see it then got better. And then on the 17th of January, we changed our patrol pattern. And our compliance during that period was somewhere between 85 and 95% most of the days. So this is not an implementation failure. We got people to go out to the hotspots, and we got a lot of additional visible police presence in these locations. Now, you might ask, what were the changes from AVERT to 1A to 1B? This is a complicated chart. The important things, as you sort of run down from the top, same time of day, same number of officers, basically the same way of paying for it. But we targeted, when we went to AVERT 1B, we started targeting fewer locations. So instead of 170 being targeted across London, we really only targeted 108. And we also added, I don't know if this mouse can be seen up there. No, I can't. You see the number of permanent treatment hexagons per day. During AVERT 1A, there was no such thing as permanent treatment hexagons. But in AVERT 1B, we turned on about 36, we have 36 locations across London, became permanent treatment. They got patrolled every single day so that the police presence was no longer random, it was just there every single day. And that has really important effects later on that we didn't expect. Those of us who have suffered through AVERT have seen this slide before. The first thing I have to tell you is that the 2 different colors of blue aren't different. They're just blue, they're just control. I put them in there for visual differentiation. In the same way that 2 different colors of red make no difference. They're just treatment days. But this is the kind of random pattern that we see in one of our 12 basic command units, or BCUs. So this is the Central West. It's a kind of Westminster area that all the tourists are familiar with. But you can see that this is a fairly random pattern of whether a location was getting patrolled on certain days of October or was not. Now, in Avert 1B, if I put up March, it's a much different pattern. So there are these locations that have this dark blue. Dark blue actually means something now. Pure control. These spots never got patrolled at all once Avert 1B began. The darker reds, those are the places that got patrolled every single day. And then all of the other spaces that got turned on and off got turned off in a one day on, one day off pattern. So that basically we had odd and even days. So we're really talking about two very different experiments. So just to put up the sample size, we're going to analyze this in terms of location, not just the location, not just the 170 locations, but the location on each day. So how much crime took place in a location day based on the assignment. You can see we have a huge sample size that goes up into the tens of thousands. So if there is an effect to detect, this experiment with really good treatment delivery should, and with these sample sizes, should be able to detect it. Now, first question is, did the officers actually deliver a differential amount of patrol to each of these locations? So we're going to call these, in Avert 1A, we're going to call these flickering treatment. Basically, these spots went on and they went off, but these are the days when they were on. So some days they were on, but the red is the days when they were on. 171 minutes, that's a lot, almost 3 hours, of additional patrol on average to each of the hotspots. Now remember, this is officer minutes, and remember they usually worked in pairs, but sometimes one radio would work and the other radio wouldn't, so I just have to count up how many officer minutes we have. But the measure isn't so important as the difference between treatment and control, which is massive. So the control locations, both the flickering ones that were on and off, and the pure controls, basically only got about 3 or 4 minutes, which is not a whole lot. That's just incidental kind of passing through. Then during Avert 1B, we again got similar results where, but the amount of patrolling went way up because we asked them to deliver a lot more time. So instead of delivering 90 minutes, we asked them to deliver, 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think it was? Yeah. So a lot more time was spent in these hotspots during Avert 1B. So this is what you actually came here for, right? Massive amounts of patrol got delivered. We know the officers were there. The sample size is really big. What is the statistical result? Okay, so prevalence. What % of these location days produced at least one offense? And this is all offending combined. There is not a statistically significant difference for all offending combined in terms of prevalence. But surely if we counted up the number of offenses which took place, which is what we call frequency, we would get a significant result. Well, we get a little bit closer. The p-value is 0.07, so we're pretty close to that significant boundary. Still technically not significant, but crime's actually gone up on the treatment days. And actually what's doing best is the pure control locations that nobody knew the location of and could not patrol. And then finally, measuring on crime harm, again, close to a significant result, but not. But what happens here is the treatment locations and the pure control are basically tied. What goes up are these locations where we went some days, but on these particular days we weren't there. So that was a little bit disturbing, but we said, well, surely then violent crime would show a different pattern, and it really doesn't. Now, none of these are statistically significant, but the pattern is the same in all three. Where we get more violent crime are on those days, or in those locations where we went occasionally, but on that specific day we weren't there. This is not the result we wanted to see, and we discovered it in the beginning of December, then checked it again in early January, and that's why Avert 1B began after Christmas. We said something has to change, this isn't working. So it's actually something I'm enormously proud of, that we had that adaptation. We were able to move forward, but nevertheless, it is the case that we did not get the result we wanted, and we want to do something different. So we shifted to Avert 1B. We now have these permanent locations that people go to every single day, and even the places that are getting that occasional patrol, they never go more than one day without having somebody come back. We're delivering so much more patrol, and our compliance is amazing, 85 to 95% every day. So we're really pleased with what we got in Avert 1B, but then we got these results. So if you look at all offending, The big difference is when we go every day, all offending goes up. Not what we were looking for, but that's in terms of prevalence and frequency. And the key to this actually is the crime harm. And when we look at crime harm, there isn't a difference. It doesn't matter what patrol pattern we delivered. None of these bars are different, statistically or significantly different from one another. But what this implies is that whatever is happening to produce more prevalence and more frequency are probably lower end, not very harmful offenses. Which, if that's true, what we should see in violence is basically no effect. And in violence, we get basically no effect. Doesn't matter what kind of patrolling we did or whether we were there or were not there. None of these bars are significant from each other. Now, I wish I had a good explanation for why this happened. It could be that we've heard some really great stuff today. It could be that we did not actually train these officers. I mean, there were 4,200 of them. We didn't do a lot of training with 4,200 officers. They got a quick briefing at the beginning of the day and they went off. And they knew to be physically present and to deliver that amount of time, but they weren't given instructions to go out and be procedurally just or even to engage in the community. We've got some measures of engagement. Turns out they had a conversation with the public about every 90 minutes when they were patrolling, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. And then we look at other police activities, it's more rare. But the other thing I think is really important in London's case, you've already seen this graph. Okay, earlier we looked at both of these graphs to see how much time got spent by the avert officers delivering their time. But what about the rest of the Met? What were the other officers doing? So you look at the other officers, well, they were delivering a lot of patrol. Now this is Avert 1A. We can switch to Avert 1B and look at the same thing. But what we see is that the avert officers went to the treatment locations, good. Stayed away from the control locations, also good. But meanwhile, the rest of the Met was just there all the time. And as a measure of how much they were there all the time, one of the things we can do is we can look at every GPS ping produced by an avert officer inside their assigned hotspot, and then say, how many minutes did it take, plus or minus, before another Met officer who wasn't assigned to avert wandered into the exact same hotspot. So if you were to look at the 30-minute patrols in Avert 1A, and I'm just picking the halfway point of those, at 15 minutes, of all the pings we produced, with about 30% of the time, another Met officer wandered in, sometime plus or minus 15 minutes. So basically, during their patrol, somebody else was there 30% of the time. I kind of hoped that our patrols would be a unique contribution that the public wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But in this case, 30% of the time. And then when you go out to the longer Avert 1B patrols that lasted 75 minutes, it's almost half the time somebody else from the Met wandered into the hotspot while our officers were there. So it's not necessarily a unique, different patrol pattern. And I think when we did the same kind of experiment in Western Australia, we were looking at locations that didn't get a lot of police presence, except by the people we sent. And so that's very different. Finally, I'm going to throw one last pattern in front of you. This is calls for service, so into the 999 system. All of these are statistically significant, so yay, we did something, we changed something. The pattern is generally the same in that usually the dark red bar, which is the permanent treatment location, is tied with the pure controls that never got patrolled at all. But these two bars in the middle are higher. And what's interesting to me is that when you just focus on those two bars in the middle, there's no difference at all. So that one day on, one day off pattern really didn't change anything. One of the mistakes we might have made was indeed that one day on, one day off pattern. We didn't give those places enough time to recover. They basically became patrolled all the time, whether we were there or not. But we had to change a lot of things in Avert 1B to try to do something different. So these are just my conclusions, but I think it's this one that I really want to highlight. Avert was a presence-only trial. We didn't train these officers to do anything special. What we did was ask them to go out and just be physically present, and they really did that, and they really came through. And that's a remarkable success for us. But in the end, Science is troublesome. Science will occasionally throw results out at us that we need to come to terms with. Hotspots typically work, 80 replications. In London, in this pattern, it doesn't really look like they worked, and especially not on violent crime, which is what these patrols were specifically targeted to attack. So we need to do a lot more analysis to understand exactly how this happened, what the differences were. We're in the process of doing that now, but boy, there's a lot of work. So if anybody needs a PhD thesis topic, go ahead and contact us. We have plenty of work to farm out to try to figure this out. But it does seem that location matters. Background policing matters. The nature of London, we are policed differently than most other places on the planet.
I'm going to talk about setting is really important, and as Jeff has pointed out, you're now about to go to the other end of the scale, where there most definitely isn't 170 minutes of police officer time spent in the hotspots. Bedfordshire, in the study that I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes, is famously one of the most under-resourced, or certainly underfunded forces in the country. And the hotspots are much bigger than they are in London in terms of geography, just because to try and actually get a meaningful effect and detect a change, we have to make them bigger to get the number of crimes, because there's much fewer crimes in most of Bedfordshire than there are in London. Bedfordshire is getting very used to doing randomised controlled trials now, as Michelle Legater, who's here, will attest to, because this is in the second year of GRIP funding and the second funded randomised controlled trial in hotspot policing that Bedfordshire's engaged in. And that's the reason for doing it a little bit differently. This time last year, I was talking to this conference about the first results of the first experiment, which showed quite conclusively that foot patrols worked. They reduced violent crime and robbery by about a quarter. They had an even bigger percentage reduction effect on crime harm levels in the hotspots where we carried them out. This year the message is slightly different, but the trial is slightly different. One of the key sponsors of this trial is Dr. Jackie Sabir, who was the Assistant Chief Constable in Bedfordshire at the time, has since moved on. Jackie was in charge of the armed policing resources. And at the point where I was saying to her at this time last year, you know hotspot policing works, Jackie, so why don't you just make your funding about getting out and implementing it? Jackie was very keen to continue sort of curious aspect of trying to understand what type of policing works best in hotspots. And that gave us the opportunity to test whether armed vehicles particularly can make a difference to community foot patrols. The other key difference between this year's Bedfordshire trial and last year's is that last year's was in lockdown. We were almost universally in some form of lockdown situation. This year's not so much. So we've gone into this trial with not just trying to compare patrol to no patrol. We've got two different types of patrol that we're looking at. There's foot patrols by community officers, and there are static vehicle deployments by armed response vehicles. The working theory in Bedfordshire is that the type of offenders who commit serious violent crime are aware of an armed vehicle when they see it. The vehicles you see on the screen there have a small asterisk on the front, which is the universal symbol for armed response vehicle. Not something I'm aware of. It's not something. It could be significant to the 0.05 level. Yeah, right. I don't think that is what it means though. Actually, you can take the armed bit out of it. It's a vehicle. It's a static vehicle. So we've got a test of the armed vehicle here, but we're also really comparing vehicles to foot patrols. The key theme with GRIP, the Home Office fund, which is pushing hotspot policing as a violence reduction strategy, is upskilling the forces that are engaged in it. And in Bedfordshire this year, it was Bedfordshire analysts who calculated the hotspots. The grainy map there gives you a sense of the scale. The hotspots are situated around the urban areas, but by London standards, they are not urban areas, possibly with the exception of Luton. Other than that, they're shire county areas. So this is a very different environment to the one that Jeff's been talking about. And with two different types of treatment and a control group, there's a slightly different configuration to this trial. It's the same crossover design that's inspired by the work that Jeff and Simon Williams did in Perth, where each hotspot is compared to itself. And the key aspect of that design is we can control for lots and lots of different environmental biases. You know, if the hotspot revolves around a nightclub, when we compare the same hotspot to each other, that nightclub is in both groups. So we can account for that. But the situation where we are deploying vehicle in one hotspot and two hotspots over, there's a foot patrol, gives the potential for some spillover and confusion of the differences between the two effects. So we had to do a bit of a novel design here, in which we blocked the hotspots into north and south, which is fairly arbitrary, labels given to them. There's a line which kind of cuts the hotspots roughly in half. And then we randomly assigned north and south to a different type of treatment each day and sent only the static vehicle to one and only foot patrol to the other. And there'll be some control elements in both. And lots of slides I'm going to go through to illustrate that. That's the kind of configuration you came up with. For every day of our 113 days in the experiment, we'd have 5 hotspots that were receiving 15 minutes of a vehicle driving into the hotspot, parking up in a location and looking intimidating from behind their windscreen, versus 15 minutes minimum of a friendly community officer or PCSO walking around, often double crewed, talking to people, and doing the neighbourhood policing aspect. And then we'd have double that in terms of control across the two. The hotspots are all configured on 2 years' worth of violence with injury, possession of weapon and robbery offences as the type of offences that the Home Office are driving forces to try to reduce levels of crime in. No domestics, all of those are taken out. We removed any hotspots, as Simon alluded to at the beginning, any hotspots which revolve around specific locations like a prison or a hospital, out. Not in the trial. So the results that we're conveying don't relate to that kind of specific hotspot at all. And the identification of these hotspots is more on prevalence than it is on volume, as I'll show. What we were looking for here is consistency over time of this type of crime. So we ended up with 22 hotspots, and they have one of these types of crime at least once every other month. It's not often when you think about it. And that's the problem of scale. And there is a problem of forcing this methodology into low volume areas when you're constrained by funding timelines, okay? It's just a practical aspect of implementation. These are all hotspots configured on something called a lower super output area, which is government central statistics department way of chunking up land. They all have about 1,200 people living in them. But if you're in an urban one, they're quite small. If you're in a rural one, they can be quite big. These are all the hotspots that we had in the experiment. And you can see there that the Luton Town Centre 018F dominated. This is the demonstration of the power view concept in action. It dominates by far. And again, is another good reason for using a crossover design, because we haven't got to allocate that one to either treatment or control. We're testing it against itself, and we can see what differences the patrols make in those areas. What this type of design gives to us, which Jeff and Simon and co talked about in Perth, is sequences of days. So we have, when we jumble up the assignment of these patrols, we're able to say, okay, what happens when we send a patrol in 1, 2, 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row, or where we leave it arable for 1, 2, 3, 4 days in a row? And we can start to understand more the nuances of what's going on when we're doing things repeatedly. In Perth, there was the headline finding that actually after a patrol, you can have 4 days before crime harm kicks off again. Last year in Bedfordshire, what we found was you needed to be in an area repeatedly to have a suppressive effect. That the first 2 days of initial patrol were not having that same effect as in Perth. What we found when we ran this 113-day experiment, first and foremost here is there isn't a great deal of crime. There's a very low base rate level of crime. which undoubtedly impacts on these findings in the same way that Jeff's will in London. 9 out of 10 days not having these types of violent crime. So if you're going into patrolling these areas, you've got to be patient. It's not going to be every day that you see something. But what we found is here, in terms of the prevalence, the marked difference was with the car, with the armed response unit over the foot patrol. When we take that into the mean number of crimes per day, again, very low level, but we'd expect that with a low level of prevalence, we find no negligible differences between the foot patrol and the control condition, but the vehicle, we're getting close to statistical significance, and there's a reduction of about 26% in terms of the number of crimes. Remember, it's just a low level of crime. So there's some pause for thought there. You have that dreaded situation as a researcher where you think, well, I haven't got a statistically significant finding by the convention, what the hell am I going to do? And then Professor Sherman came up with carryover and washout effects, which is the next avenue to go in, and starting to think about whether, when we send a patrol in, as they found in Perth, there is a lingering effect that goes into the next day, suppresses the crime rate down, and then obscures the effect size of the patrol. So the concept here is, if you do a patrol on day 1 in a hotspot, and then you don't do it on day 2 or day 3, is the memory, the citing of that police deployment on day 1 affecting day 2? But by the time you get to day 3, well, they're comfortable again, so offending starts. The antidote to that, or the control for it, if you will, is to introduce what they call a washout period. Remove a day, if you like, from the analytical period, and then compare. But now I'm comparing day 1 against day 3. So that's the next step. That doesn't have the expected effects either. The statistical significance is marginally improved, but when you factor in a washout period, the actual reductions are not greatly different to they are with the washout period, which gives us some more pause for thought about how washout periods work, whether that actually can play out in a large hotspot compared to a small hotspot, and there's more room to go in that analysis. What we have found, though, is a replication of this repeated cumulative deterrence effect. So the blue bars on that graph are the prevalence for each consecutive day of patrol in the first experiment that we did in 2020. And the red bars are the latest experiment. What you can see here is slightly less total reduction effect, but consistent. The more you go into the area, one day after another, the more you suppress these types of crime. That's the key takeaway. Now, with Simon and the work that has been going on with the GRIP Fund, looking at where do we go next with this in the latest round of GRIP funding, the Home Office are stumping up 3 years' worth of funding to about 20 forces for implementation of hotspots policing. And I think now the attention, certainly in Bedfordshire, is turning to just operationalising it, just making it part of the day-to-day rhythm of policing. I think there's a need to think, and this sort of follows on nicely from what we've been talking about. Look, not every place is the same. I don't think we can assume that you can do the same hotspot policing response across areas or even within different parts of the same policing jurisdiction. So in Bedfordshire, we're now looking at working on customised hotspot strategies for individual hotspots. And we've looked at 21 or 22, and actually you saw in the graph that actually the top 4 or 5 of those have a largely disproportionate effect, and that might be the best place to start concentrating the resources. There is of course room to adjust for events, seasonality, different patterns in the week within those hotspots. The crucial thing, I think, that we're going to try this year is to build those in collaboration with operational teams and get that insight from officers who are actually going to be out doing those patrols to shape those plans. Once those plans are there, they should be openly accessible to everybody who works in that area, so they can take that instruction as a default. Embedded tracking. Lots and lots of work gone on in London to process airways data, gone on across the grip forces to come up with GPS solutions. And lots of forces are in a good place now in terms of the equipment they have to record officer locations. The next challenge is about using that data, mountains and mountains of data, every day to inform your daily management meetings or your daily coordination meetings of where your officers have been in the last 24 hours and play that into your daily taskings. The final thing is to make this a habit. We saw the same thing in Bedfordshire as Jeff saw in London. The longer the experiment went on, the higher the compliance got. The more this becomes just the daily rhythm of policing, the more effect I think it can have, and that's certainly what the results in Bedfordshire have shown to this point.
So in the remaining time, I'm going to offer an alternative view on hotspots policing, still within the world of hotspots, and still police are involved, but perhaps somebody else should do the hotspots policing instead of the officers. So the problem that we have is that the science behind hotspots policing is robust. We know that hotspots exist. It's not a myth. We see them everywhere. We also know that it does tend to work, generally speaking. We do see hotspots policing experiments around the globe showing an effect that crime goes down once officers patrol these hotspots. But on the other hand, we have some pragmatic issues. Officers don't like to do hotspots policing. It's not easy to do. And as far as I can tell, and I wish there was more evidence to look into this, once the experimenters are out, many police departments, police forces do not continue on with hotspots policing. So the operation is over, and then when you look back into these forces, whether they actually do hotspots policing, at least the way that we see it, we don't see it as often. So the question is what to do with this sort of information. Do we need to push harder? Do we need to have different messages? Or maybe we need to think alternatively, looking at a different sort of way of doing this. So yeah, I don't think hotspots policing the way that it is now is sustainable. I think that because we have so many issues with implementation and getting officers to do the job, perhaps it's not as implementable as we think. I mean, we have the issue of officers not giving us enough time. So the Met has shown that they can, but it took a lot of effort to actually get to the point of delivery. But they have this concept of whoosh policing, just driving by the hotspot, not doing more than a couple of minutes, just taking the time to do this. This is the term we learned in Trinidad and Tobago. Officers out there in the wild will tell you that they do hotspots policing, but they patrol around the hotspot, not necessarily in the specific place where the crime is located. They think that they go to the hotspots, but actually not the hotspots. And in business as usual conditions, officers tend to go to places that have been affected by crime recently, the recency effect, so not necessarily based on the patterns, the long-term pattern of where crime actually concentrates. And then from the implementation side, we have some evidence I'm going to show in just a second that officers find it quite boring. It's very difficult for them to actually deliver those 15 minutes that we want. It might have to be something with culture of policing. Many people join the police department not to become guardians. They're there to be hunters, to go out there and catch bad people. And when you put them in a hotspot, in a place that doesn't necessarily have any crime because they're there, they don't see prevention. And if you do see prevention, it's not something that is usually held in policing. It's not something that we don't give prizes for prevention. We give prizes for catching bad people. So the culture has to change in that sense as well. But I think the main driver from this idea is that there's simply, at least in the UK context, there's just not enough resources. I mean, if you ask any average officer, how are you doing? The first thing they tell you is busy, really busy. And I think they're right. There's something to it. They don't have that luxury to go out there and patrol and prevent crime, where they have all these calls and jobs coming in. So maybe we should listen to them. So if you do listen to them and you look at some of the work, this is correlational, it's a survey, response rate issues and so on. We could go through this forever, but the problem is that officers are telling us that the elements of hotspots policing, the tracking of it, the GPS, the being told where to go, they're not for it. And it's very difficult to convince them otherwise, as we have seen. So how can we resolve these issues? So one option, as we heard before, is perhaps push it harder, to just keep on pushing and make officers do it. That's one option. Another option might be to mandate it, to have it part of the policy, which you just heard before. And perhaps maybe we should revise the plan and have somebody else do it to some extent. So how can it be done? Well, So how can it be done? Well, the police own the data. The police know where hotspots are. They know professionally what to do in these hotspots. They know whom to target and what to do. They know the nominals. They have the list of individuals. They can care for the victims as they normally would. But perhaps somebody else should deliver the treatment itself. So the first question comes to mind is, will we get the same effect if we get other people doing the same sort of work, and you see some results? And academics should be involved in doing the evaluations as well, as we've done for some time. So if you think of a model, right, a model in policing, you can think of, because of the numbers, and the triangle you see here depends on cost and scarcity of resources and the specialization that officers may have. Perhaps the ones that should do the hotspots policing patrols, the preventative patrols, will be non-police or security agents, or maybe somebody within the police family, but not the PCs, not the police constables, PCSOs, specials, and so on. So they're still police officers, but they're not the PCs that are very expensive in policing. And then the officers can do other things, like problem-oriented policing, special operations, and you go up into more specialized policing, like high policing, like organized crime, and so on. We have loads of examples. It's not something new. I'm not saying anything new. You all heard this and know about this from other contexts, but you see loads of examples where you see this interagency collaboration. That it is working out there in the field. The question is whether it's working or not. So I'm going to give you briefly, because I'm running short on time, just 3 quick examples of where this thing actually has worked. So one area is PCSOs, really interesting area of research in my opinion. You know, there's a lot to be done with this group of officers. There were 2 experiments that we've conducted over the years in Birmingham South and Peterborough. Very similar, PCSOs being sent to hotspots to patrol these hotspots, to be present in those hotspots. They have to travel by foot from one hotspot to the next, so it's foot patrol, not something else. And it was very regimented. You can do that. You can tell the officers, the PCSOs, when to start, for how long to be in the hotspot. You can track them these days of where they go. Maybe you can look at hot routes, if you will, and see if there's any effect on crime in the areas where they walk. And just keep on going at it and ask them to do those patrols in ways that potentially will be effective in reducing and preventing crime. Now, I'm fully aware that PCSOs and specials and so on do not have the same powers as PCs. Of course not. But that's not the point. The question is, can we deter people from committing crime by having somebody with a uniform around? And if that's the case, if you're getting the same result, why not try it and do more of it? So these experiments show significant reductions, statistically significant reductions in crime. These are recorded crimes in both Birmingham South as well as Peterborough. They all show quite substantial reductions in crime delivered by PCSOs, strictly by PCSOs. Then you can ask yourself, okay, well, if PCSOs can do it, what about security guards? You know, maybe they can reduce crime as well. So we've done an experiment with Southwest Trains. And in this environment, you know, I dare you to find the security guard. I don't know if you can see that person. Well, it's actually here. You know, can that person deter offenders? You know, and you can, especially when it's very busy, can they actually have an impact on crime that goes all throughout the station environment, or the station area? So we had some GPS trackers, and we know how much time was spent in the hotspots, the designated hotspots. I should have mentioned and pointed out, those hotspots were designed and defined by the police. And then the patrol was conducted by those security guards. And then in terms of the different crime types and the reduction that you see in crime, you're getting a 32% reduction against the body offenses. So it's quite substantial. It's not nothing. You know, it's quite a big effect, as you can see here. What about street pastors? They have them all around the country. Very interesting. These are people that care. They're not in it for the money. They're just people that really want to make a difference. And they're out there to help people getting too drunk, youth, and so on. But they're very visible. You can see them from everywhere. And there are different kinds of things we can analyze when we're looking outside the police. So one of them, of course, is the street pastors. And I'm going to focus just on one because of lack of time, of what happens in nighttime economy. So again, if you've been out, going out, you may have seen them in different places in different cities, but they're quite visible. They got big vans and they wear a uniform. They are noticeable. That's the main sort of element here because they send a message we hear. And based on a relatively short experiment, you can see that there's not much of a huge difference between officers patrolling these specific hotspots and pastors just positioned at the places and being visible and do what they do best. We don't tell them what to do, but we know where to send them based on police records. So why is that the case? Why would we find this to work? Well, first of all, accountability, because pastors or PCSOs or guards, their responsibility is to cool down the place. So if people have accountability and people know that that person has an accountability to make sure that if something happens to do something with it, then there is an effect. You can also go into deterrence theory and ask yourself, what deters people from committing a crime? So I don't know about you, but if there's somebody of authority standing outside, whether a police officer or a guard, I'm not going to rob you because I'm going to get caught. Maybe that person's not going to nail me down, but they can call somebody very quickly to then arrest me. So you're sending a deterrent message simply by using the uniform. So what are the benefits of this model if you think about it and what things we can get out of it? Well, first of all, again, the problem that we just don't have the resources. If you don't have the resources to do hotspots, then maybe somebody else should do it. And if you're getting the same effect, and it might cost less than actually doing it yourself, then why not utilize these officers? And the Sentinels is really interesting because there are a lot of organizations like this out there in the community that want to do this. They just need the guidance to know where they're supposed to go. Thank you.
Thanks for all of those three presentations. The question to Jeff, and actually tying it into Barak's presentation. So, Jeff, you showed that there was actually an increase in the hotspots of certain types of crime. And I was wondering if you can distinguish between whether a crime was reported by an officer or by a citizen. And if we look at Barak, he showed that there was an increase in ticket fraud and drugs, but a decrease in other ones. And I would actually suggest that ticket fraud and drugs might be more officer reported. So they find it on people, they do search and stop. And maybe in your data set, is there any chance to distinguish between this kind of reporting type and maybe then we see different results for all these hotspots? So
we can differentiate in between police-reported crime. There was that slide at the end that showed there was police-generated calls for service, and that had the same pattern as crimes. We have not done that in our final analysis yet, but we did do it in an interim analysis in like December, January, and I think again in February. It didn't really make any difference who reported it, at least in our data. The crime pattern stayed the same.
Yeah, as for the difference between, it's called victim-generated crime and police-generated crime, this is a very important distinction, which sometimes statisticians miss. It's a very important difference because you want to reduce the crimes that are coming from the public, and you want to increase, if at all, the crimes that are coming from the ones that are patrolling. So, of course, you would get more drugs, and of course, you get more fraud because that's their job. They're expected to find this, whereas you would also expect to see a reduction in crime coming from the public because potentially they're reducing crime through deterrence.